All right. Well, I think it's okay to get started now. So, welcome everyone. My name's Kathleen Shearer, and I'm the Executive Director of CORE, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories. We are an international association that is building repository interoperability around the world. And among other things, we are sort of the international voice for repositories. And I'm here today with my colleague Peter Noth, who runs a service that he will introduce to you called the other core, Apple Core, C-O-R-E, and Martin Klein, my colleague who's a co-principal investigator on the Core Notify project, which is building a protocol to connect repository resources with other types of services and infrastructure in the scholarly communication environment. So it's a pleasure to be here. We're going to try to leave some time at the end of our collective presentation so that we can have a discussion or some questions and answers. But I will get started. Martin, next slide, please. I just wanted to remind us of why we're doing all of this and why open science is so important. So I often start my presentation with two slides. One is that, really, we strongly believe that knowledge is a public good, and whatever infrastructure and policies we put in place should really have this as the foundation for supporting open science as we move forward. Next slide, Martin. And then this is the second slide, which I think is key, is what kind of, what do researchers really want, in the coming years, in the future? How are they going to be using resources? And we were presented with a very compelling vision by a neurobiologist, Bjorn Brems, in 2022, where he said, researchers really want, ideally, all kinds of different types of content available to them, version controls, but openly licensed so they can be text and data mined, not long time waiting times for publication, but near immediate publication, open to everyone, contributions acknowledged, including more beyond just authorship and so on. So these are the two things that are sort of driving a lot of the work that we do at CORE, and also some of the projects that we are participating in that you'll hear about today. And I think another very important contextual point is that, of course, research is global, and there has been a lot of emphasis in the past, 50 years and more perhaps, on how research is international and we should be publishing in international journals. But maybe slightly neglected is that research is also very local. There are a lot of problems and challenges and issues that deserve attention at the local level. And that research can be taken off the priority list of many countries because of the research assessment practices and a lot of pressure to publish in international journals. So we really need to rethink this balance in terms of how we present the infrastructure for scholarly communication to support both these needs. Global research, which essentially means interoperability, and local research, which means local infrastructure supporting a variety of needs. Next slide, please. So this is what we call sort of bibliodiversity. We're trying to create a scholarly communications ecosystem that can accommodate a lot of different languages, different types of publication outputs, different research priorities in different countries, different domains, and so on. And so what we're going to present to you today is a kind of a global or international model that will help to support this bibliodiversity that we think is so important. Next slide, please, Martin. So obviously repositories are key to this landscape. A lot of times the focus has been on publications for the discussions around open access, but I mean, for open science, repositories are fundamental. Not only do they collect research data, code, and many, many other types of research output, they are the infrastructures that also allow researchers to deposit their articles in a way where the researchers do not have to pay to publish, or users do not have to pay to access. So we see repositories as the foundation of a global open science ecosystem. There are at least 6,000 repositories around the world right now. And so this in itself kind of creates a challenge, because how do you manage all those 6,000 repositories so that they're cohesive enough to be able to present in a discoverable way the content that is contained within all of those repositories? Next slide, please. This is maybe not so relevant for people outside of Europe, but I think the results are very, very generalizable, especially to the United States and other Western countries. We CORE with Liber, OpenAIRE, and Spark Europe did a survey of repositories in Europe in the spring. And the preliminary results of this repository survey were that repositories are very sustainable, not-for-profit infrastructures. So they are infrastructures that are easy and accessible to researchers and users. They already contain hundreds of millions of items, and they play a key role in supporting this bibliodiversity. And you can imagine in Europe and many other countries, bibliodiversity is very important, given especially the language differences, but also the growing interest in sharing a diversity of content types. On the other hand, they're kind of relatively low, under-resourced, I would say, generally speaking. And there are challenges around managing the technical aspect of repositories, because they're often based at universities and they don't have necessarily always the technical expertise. So I think this is the current state of repositories that we see generally around the world, but in particular, it would be very similar in Europe as it is in the United States and in Canada and sort of some of those northern countries. Next slide, please. So for CORE, we feel that, we don't believe that the right approach for advancing open science is building 3 or 4 really powerful centralized infrastructures. It cannot support our vision. You create a sort of centralized point of failure if you do that, or if the government changes, if it's a big centralized governmental repository, if the government changes, they might decide not to fund that repository anymore. So we really think there's a lot of strength in this distributed environment. But absolutely critical for that is having this underlying interoperability, so that repositories behave the same way and can be brought to the content in repositories can be brought together to be able to be discovered and reused. So this is critical for the mission and the objectives of CORE. Next slide, please. So in order to advance our vision, very importantly, we are working with national and regional entities. They're different in kind and type depending on the region or country that we're working in. But today I'd just like to focus on the US environment. I guess it was about 2 years ago, CORE and Spark launched The United States Repository Network, we just use USRN for short. And with that network, we really want to build a much more cohesive group of repositories, a cohesive network of repositories in the US to really ensure that they're adopting best practices and are able to support like the 21st century needs of researchers in the future, as well as any new policies that are going to be adopted by the US agencies. And I noticed that Tina Bache is here in the event today. So she has been the person who really drove this along. She's moving on to another position, but she's the person who's really driven this work along. So she will be also here in case you have any more detailed questions about USRN. Next slide, Martin. So, I mean, very briefly, the strategic vision here is to create this interoperable network of repositories that become really an essential component. It's part of the national research infrastructure, and, you know, offering the functionality that is required to really advance open science. And actually, right today, I'm in Rio de Janeiro, where we had meetings with the regional network of repositories in Latin America. And actually, they have integrated in a very formalized way the repository networks in their countries. So their policies rely now on the distributed network of institutional repositories in Latin America. And so I really think this is the right way forward, and the way forward that will really support our needs over the long term and in a sustainable way. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who has been working on a pilot project for USRN that he will tell you more about. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kathleen. So very pleased to be here. And in my part, I would like to introduce you to the US Repository Network project, which we started in October last year. And the project will run initially for a year. And I will particularly focus on how this project and our activities will help by facilitating the interoperability in this sort of distributed environment of repositories. I think, as Kathleen mentioned already previously, the value of each repository is limited. The global value really comes when you put these repositories together and when they start behaving in a particular way, so that we can rely on their behavior being sort of similar and or identical, basically, to some extent, and then we create effectively a seamless layer across the content of these repositories. Please, can I get the next slide? So in this project, this is a project which is a collaboration of CORE Connecting Repositories, of CORE Confederation of Open Access Repositories, AntLeaf, and Spark, and we're really pleased with this collaboration and very excited about this. And I'll tell you more about this. Next slide, please. The project is supported by the Confederation, by the Connecting Repositories core platform, basically. And let me just introduce you a little bit to CORE. CORE has been around for more than 10 years now, and its aim has been really to index open access research worldwide and deliver unrestricted access to open research for all. It is a very much used scholarly database of open access research papers. We've got about 20 million monthly active users. It is a completely not-for-profit scholarly infrastructure which is dedicated to the open access mission. And CORE is also an adopter of the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, POSI principles. And our mission has been, actually next slide, has been very much to serve and support the network of open access repositories and journals. CORE has been initially started in the UK, but it has always been focusing on aggregating data from around the world. And I think in my next slide, please, in my discussion or in my presentation, I will try to make it to sort of explain how actually what Kathleen was referring to, this local and global effectively come together with CORE. So Core is also a service that is community governed. We have become a community governed service quite recently, and we feel that this has been an amazing journey, and we are now building a network of supporters. We call it the board of supporters, who are effectively the repositories that decide to commit to contribute to our sort of operation, and they also help us to prioritize what we need to build, basically, and how we should be building it. So we're working very closely with repositories at the moment and trying to co-design any future developments together with them. Next slide, please. At this point in time, Core indexes content from around the world, but Core is very well known, in particular in the UK, and we are now trying to apply Core as part of this project as a service that effectively helps the USRN network to become stronger and become more interoperable. Next slide, please. So about a year ago, we met with the USRN network. This was prior to the beginning of this project. And we sort of did a little bit of a mapping exercise for the United States. And we realized that there are about more than 800 repositories, in fact, about 63 million metadata records from US repositories, with just over 9 million full texts stored in US repositories. And that was actually what we already had indexed in Core at that point. But we also realized, we looked a little bit about at the quality of the metadata, and we realized that it's been not ideal, and we have seen quite poor quality of metadata across the United States, basically. And so we said that what would be really useful would be to create a project that tries to improve the practices that are used by repositories, and to sort of raise awareness of how to expose metadata and how to effectively become an interoperable repository, to set example for everyone else, basically. And so as a result of that, as part of the USRN project, we said that we are going to initially take 20 repositories who we will be helping, basically, and working with more closely. Next slide, please. And these are the institutions that have sort of accepted participation in the USRN Discovery pilot. Next slide, please. I'd like to maybe come a little bit back, and I'd like to explain why it is important for a repository to effectively expose data in an interoperable fashion. At Core, we have been building different kinds of services, a variety of services to support repositories and to support sort of cross-repository functionalities. And so these include search, they include recommendation, and they include a service that we call discovery. Next slide, please. So what search is effectively is I think that's not going to be very surprising for people. It's a full text search which allows you to search content across repositories, not within one repository, but across any repository. A recommender system is a system that you can embed into, and we've got this system embedded into more than 500 repositories at the moment, including archive.org. And this system effectively allows you to, or provides a recommendation on similar content, regardless of where the content is stored. Basically. And so people can, or users can navigate from one repository to another based on similarity and find similar articles. And a Core discovery system is a system that helps people, basically, or a service that helps people to find open access copies of content based on their descriptions or just based on their DOIs. So I guess that this is just to provide, in fact, sort of examples of how one can build services that add value on top of the content once all the repositories expose the content in an appropriate way. Another service is what we call the OAI Resolver. This is a service that effectively helps organizations to freely assign that effectively helps institutions to identify and route OAI identifiers, which are identifiers which are assigned automatically during the process of exposing content via a well-known protocol, which is used by repositories called OAI PMH. And effectively, we as the core run a resolver for these OAI identifiers, which means that for any OAI identifier, I can resolve it to the landing page within the specific repository system. And this is a distributed way of assigning identifiers to repository content. Next slide, please. And finally, actually, maybe not finally, but nearly finally, we provide several services that enable or help repositories or create a seamless layer for machine-readable research. So effectively, we deliver API. People can also download a dataset of content that we've collected and indexed from across repositories. And these three services can be used to develop completely new applications on top of Core. So we see Core as an enabler that helps other people to build new applications, that helps people to deliver on new use cases, and that effectively helps to kickstart new projects. And so just to give you a couple of examples of what these could be, many of these might utilize artificial intelligence. Many of them might be various kinds of intelligent applications. They can include things such as plagiarism detection, fact-checking, misinformation detection. They can include things like identifying suitable peer reviewers, compliance monitoring, drug discovery, and so forth. And for each of these categories that I mentioned, we actually have a partner who does something like this on top of the core content. So effectively, by making sure that your content is integrated in core, and actually not just in core, but is correctly indexed, institutions are making their content more reusable and discoverable for other applications too. I just want to mention here one very quick example. This is something that people have been quite excited about last year. We have done a paper on something which we call Core GPT. In Core, we've been collecting content, and GPT is, of course, a well-known large language model, and we've decided to put them together. Martin, next slide, please. And we've put them together to create something like a question answering system on top of just scientific content. And so people can ask a question. Next slide. Actually, maybe you can go directly. The question can be, what are the latest research trends in biomimicry, for instance? Next slide, please. And what the system does is that it produces and synthesizes an answer to any such question just based on research literature, and it provides references to those specific research papers. And so I like this example very much because I think it really nicely demonstrates the value of in principle, what we want to achieve here is that we want to have a resilient network of repositories. Resilient means that there are some redundancies, and that if one repository is withdrawn, then nothing's going to fall apart. But at the same time, we need to be able to pull content very quickly from many different repositories in order to be able to synthesize this within a minute. If someone, or a couple of seconds, in fact, when someone asks a question, they should be able to pull together relevant data from across these repositories. And I think that's what really interoperability is about. It's a really nice example of how interoperability can serve and enhance our experience. Next slide, please. I just want to come back quickly to the USRN pilot. So just to tell you a little bit more about what we are doing in the US Repositories Network pilot, we have already identified these 20 repositories. We are now analyzing, basically, or we have actually analyzed how we looked at how technically they expose data, and we've done a survey and some sort of an initial analysis, and we've identified actually many different problems in those repositories. Next slide, please. These problems might look like a spreadsheet, basically, with lots of problems identified, and we've been contacting these repositories and asking them and helping them to effectively improve the situation. And at the end of the project, what we are going to do is to effectively assess how we help these institutions and to what extent we changed and improved it. Next slide, please. So what were some of the issues that we have identified? So we have identified a wide range of issues where, for instance, the institutions are not necessarily exposing the metadata in the right way. Actually their OAI-PMH endpoint isn't properly configured. There might be, for instance, persistent identifiers that might not be expressed correctly in the metadata, and so forth and so forth. What is, I think, quite interesting is that in many situations, the institutions were completely unaware of these shortcomings, and therefore by working with us, they are discovering new things, and hopefully we are moving together towards a more interoperable network of repositories. Next slide, please. And so from this experience, we have also developed something which we call the Core Data Provider Guidelines. These are effectively guidelines that tell institutions exactly how Core works, and it tells them what they can do in order to make sure that their metadata are exposed correctly, their repository is configured correctly, and that they also expose correctly the full text. Next slide, please. Yes, I think I can skip this now. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, in addition to this, and I'm just slowly coming to the end of my presentation, we are also making some improvements to existing core services to provide more value to these institutions. I didn't speak very much about one service that Core provides, which is the Core Repository Dashboard. The Core Repository Dashboard is a service, basically, which enables institutions to see how they can see their repository, the content of their repository, and they can somehow manage that content. And through that Core Repository Dashboard, we can deliver value-added services for these repositories. And so some of these services which we are going to improve as part of the USRN network is an enrichment service, which helps institutions to effectively find identifiers for content that they have not expressed, but we can find it because we see it in other databases. We are helping them with we are helping them to show by showing basically how often we index them and highlighting any problems that we identify with those indexing processes so that they can internally fix them. We are building a module which we call Fresh Finds. This is a module which will help an institution to discover research articles that are authored by their academics, which they are not aware of and which they do not have in their repository, effectively trying to tell them that perhaps they might want to add that article in order, and which could be important for in the future for open access compliance. Next slide, please. We're also providing a module which we call a health check, that really is a check for like a technological check, basically, which will help institutions to ensure that their repository is healthy and remains properly configured for indexing within the repositories network. And we are also developing ideas around something which we call fair certification. So effectively ensuring, again, that the repository meets some of the best practices. Next slide, please. Okay, almost coming towards the end. We are also very much aware of the Nelson memo. And in the UK, we have recently developed a module for open access compliance, which is to support repositories in the UK to make sure that they are compliant with the UKRI open access policy, where we are looking into how we can develop a very similar module or adapt the module that we've already been using for UK institutions to support institutions in the United States. And we're looking very closely into this, and we hope to have something developed by the end of this year. Next slide, please. Actually, next slide. Thank you. So just the take-home message is really that CORE is a community-governed open scholar infrastructure. We are really using it as part of the USRN project as a platform to help institutions to express and expose data in a more interoperable way, ensuring that they really their metadata and their repositories are configured in such a way that the whole network can take advantage of it. By doing so, by integrating this content, we are going to help and make it possible for also others, not just us, in fact, to come up with and make use of AI and text binding. And effectively, both the data providers as well as the data, as those who need to use the data, will be able to access the data more easily and in a seamless manner. So the key outputs of the USRN project will be, of course, the adoption of some best practices, and we will be we are creating basically a couple of we're setting basically best practices and best practice examples for others to follow. And that's, I suppose, all from me. I just wanted to highlight that CORE is a community-governed institution, and if institutions are interested, repository institutions or data providers interested in becoming our members, they are more than welcome to do so. And we also offer free membership. So if any institutions want to join and make use of our services, then we will be delighted to hear from them. That's all from me. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Martin. And
Thanks,
I suppose the key link between me and Martin is that Martin comes somehow almost before, because Martin has been developing lots of protocols, basically, which are absolutely essential for the functionality of these repositories. And we sort of come after Martin has developed these protocols, basically, and his colleagues, to sort of make sure that these protocols that repositories actually do it in the way that Martin intended.
Thanks, Peter. I just maybe add a couple of things to your presentation, because I think it's important to note that the Discovery Project is working with 20 repositories now, but the real intent is to come out with very concrete recommendations, guidelines, resources to help all repositories in the United States move towards best practices. So Peter is looking really at what repositories need to do to really interact with these very important discovery services that are part of the whole ecosystem. And then we have a number of other best practices that will come out of the desired characteristics for repositories that were developed by USRN last year and are based on international best practices. So we'll also be working with repositories to develop resources to help them move forward with all of these good practices. So we're starting with a small pilot community, but the idea is really to raise the level of all repositories in the US to a certain high level of functionality. And with that, I'll turn it over to Martin, who, as Peter says, has been developing protocols for many years. But I think we'd like to really present something that we see as a very innovative new protocol that will allow repositories to interact with other types of infrastructures and services, and especially focusing at this moment on peer review. So in essence, offering a much more distributed approach to publishing, where the publishing workflow is not in a single infrastructure, but can be undertaken through using a protocol to interact between content in a repository and an external peer review service. So Martin, please go ahead.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Peter. So yeah, I will be talking a little bit about the core Notify initiative, and we'll try to make the case of how Notify fits into this landscape, and it actually advances the state of the art when we're moving towards a more distributed, more sustainable, more standards-based and community built sort of open scholarly communication infrastructure and ecosystem. So before we start, let me briefly announce, or not announce, but acknowledge rather, that the Notify initiative is generously funded by the Arcadia Foundation. So we are very grateful for the support that makes this sort of initiative possible. So I'm one of four co-PIs on the project. So this is a picture of the all-star team that's behind the Notify initiative. So this is of course Kathleen, Paul Vork from Antleaf, Eli Rodriguez from the University of Minho, Tammy and Carla as well, and myself. And we have a couple of folks on the team that we call expert technical advisors, Herbert van der Zampel and Patrick Hoosenberg, who you may be familiar with or aware of currently at the University of Ghent. So if you have not heard of Core Notify yet, though we've done a good bit of outreach already, so this may be a little bit familiar to you, but just to reiterate what Core Notify is all about, and this is kind of our elevator pitch, right? What do we try to accomplish within the initiative? And it is really an approach to connect, to link research outputs hosted in a distributed environment of repositories on the one side, with resources related to those research outputs that are hosted in different repositories and different services in external value-added platforms on the web. Right? And we're trying to establish these links and inform these distinct parties about connected resources or related resources by developing standards-based and therefore interoperable and decentralized approach. And hopefully within the next few minutes, this will become more clear to you what we actually mean by these key phrases, right? And how this can be really implemented in practice, and therefore further the agenda towards an interoperable ecosystem of repositories. To maybe make this a little bit more precise as of now, right? So our overarching goal is to connect related resources on the web that are hosted in a distributed ecosystem of platforms, including, of course, repositories and preprint services. And we're doing so by utilizing established W3C standards. We do believe this is absolutely essential to build on standards rather than to reinvent the wheel. And to be quite honest, we've been in those situations before, and we've fought these battles of adoptions, and we basically failed. So building on adopted standards is absolutely a core principle that we're pursuing here. Specifically, we're utilizing two standards: the linked data notifications and activity streams 2. I'll get to this in a second, but those are the standards that we're building our technology on top of. And as I'm sure you know, by building upon existing standards, the level of reusability and utilization of implementations is very, very high. Right? So regardless of what your use case is, a Notify implementation basically allows to accommodate for different use cases that you may find yourself focusing on in your environment. We're really following the principles of the web, which means our notifications are based on the principle of passing by reference rather than by copy. And basically what this means is we're just sending notifications that contain identifiers, or links, URLs, DOIs, if you will, persistent identifiers, rather than actually copying PDF documents, for example, from one platform to another. So I think that's important to note because that keeps our protocol and our initiative very lightweight, and also lowers the barrier of adoption here. We do propose and promote related concepts and principles and frameworks such as signposting that allow this notion of following links, follow your nose, if you will, on the web to discover related resources about a manuscript, for example, that is subject to peer review. As Kathleen has already alluded to initially, we're focusing on the use case of establishing a a standards-based approach basically to facilitate peer review on manuscripts hosted in repositories. However, we're not limited, by far not limited to this one use case. Several different use cases, as I will allude to in a second, are in scope for the initiative. Please allow me two very quick slides on the technology front of things. I mentioned linked data notifications as one of the two standards that we're building upon. If you're not familiar with LDN, don't worry. It's a very lightweight, and that's really all anybody should know about this. It's a very lightweight protocol to send notifications from system A to system B. It is based on HTTP, so this is a language that everybody speaks. And conceptually, you can think of this not dissimilar to email, right? You send a notification from A to B. The second technology is, so the standard is called Activity Streams 2. And that is the standard that really defines the payload of our messages. So this is the content of the message that gets sent from system A to system B. It is just very briefly, it's serialized as JSON-LD. So that is something that, your developer will tell you, yay, this is great. Machines love it, developers love it. It's the lingua franca these days anyways. And as I mentioned, and there's an example here on the slide of a payload that's not necessarily meant to be read, but you can probably already see that this is a very lightweight payload, right? Again, this is not containing a PDF document or anything else. This is just some identifiers, just a teeny tiny bit of metadata that is absolutely essential for machines to learn more about the resource that is it's the content of the context of this notification here. And we do believe by keeping this message very lightweight, by introducing very little, absolutely the minimum amount of vocabulary in this message, we're really massively increasing the chances of interoperability here, right? Because we're not basically locking ourselves in, we're not trying to over-engineer these messages, and therefore, excluding other use cases that are related or tangential. So by means of a very simple example, let me briefly give you basically a demonstration of how Notify can work, and actually, in fact, in this case, even works in real life, in reality. So this is a conceptual view of an implementation that is currently in place using Notify and to connect resources hosted at distinct parties on the web. So on the left-hand side, we have our repository, HAL, the French National Repository. And on the right-hand side of this graph, of this slide here, we have a PCI, which basically is a peer review service, if you will. So I'm a good scholar, right? I deposit preprints, and I deposit this on HAL, let's say, and my manuscript is being published by HAL, and it gets a URL, so it's accessible on the web, right? Let's say my manuscript is available at URI P for preprint. Now, I would like others to take a look at this. I would like to request a peer review on my manuscript, and HAL now allows me or enables me to send a review request notification to PCI. So PCI now will gather some metadata about this preprint and will consider whether it is able to conduct peer review on my preprint, right? Whether it's topical in scope, let's say, and whether PCI actually has the resources to conduct the peer review. If PCI agrees to review this manuscript, it would send a notification back to HAL and say, yes, we accept your request for peer review. We will conduct a peer review on your manuscript. So now we already have the situation that both... Was it me? No, okay. Now we already have a situation where both parties can establish further information on their respective platforms, right? HAL can already promote, here's a manuscript that I've published, and PCI is currently conducting peer review on my manuscript. PCI, on the other hand, can basically announce on their website, let's say, a piece of information that conveys, I'm currently conducting a peer review on a manuscript hosted at HAL. Eventually, PCI will conclude the peer review on the manuscript, and once the peer review is concluded, let's say for the sake of argument, PCI publishes this peer review, makes it available on the web by means of assigning a URI, let's say URI R for review. The other thing that PCI would do is send yet another notification back to HAL, informing the repository about the availability of the peer review. So now we have established a tight connection, and both parties can establish links to related resources, right? Hull on the one hand side can, for example, on the landing page of the manuscript, can also include a link to the corresponding peer review hosted on the PCI side. And PCI can likewise so establish a link to the manuscript when talking about the peer review that it has published. Right? So again, we're not necessarily copying documents, copying files, but establishing a communication that is based on links to these related resources. So now, if we're thinking this, if we're trying to think a little bit ahead, maybe, or consider different use cases that go beyond the peer review on manuscript scenario, what else can we think of? Well, something else that we envisioned, and we also heard of from different implementation partners here, that establishing connection between related different sort of resources, and Kathleen had alluded to this earlier, in the ecosystem of repositories, well, that will facilitate a significant step forward, right? So, for example, if we are connecting a manuscript hosted in our institutional repository, let's say a DSpace instance, with a piece of source code that is related to the manuscript, but hosted in Zenodo, for example, and also connecting it to a data set that was generated within the research lifecycle that resulted in the manuscript, but it's hosted on Dataverse. Can we connect these three different related resources that are hosted on just different platforms, right? And as you can already see, these platforms are based on different software systems, probably based on different geographic locations, probably under some different sort of policy, and so on and so forth. But they're all speaking web, basically. They're all speaking HTTP, right? Which means that Notify is a protocol that can help them to communicate about related resources. Another scenario that is maybe a little bit more abstract, if you will, is if you consider now these three different repositories with three different types of artifacts. If we now have an entity, let's say on top of that orchestrates these things, that facilitates maybe the dynamic generation of data management plan, that notifies different parties, maybe even social media platforms, if you will, about the availability of related resources. Then we can, envision scenarios of a scholarly graph that we haven't seen before, right? We can envision scenarios of research assessment that is much more comprehensive, if you will, right? We can envision scenarios where, transparency in the research endeavor and even integrity is reproducible, right? So by connecting these resources, we're really enabling downstream processes that we currently can just basically dream about, if you will. Another example is the notion of preservation and archiving of these scholarly artifacts. Now we actually can learn about the availability of related resources and can follow links and can archive data sets, for example, that are related to a manuscript otherwise. So those are all use cases that are possible, that are certainly in scope, and we're most happy to talk to anybody that is interested in further in the agenda there together with us. And let me just conclude by giving you, by now, I'm sure, a dated overview of implementation partners of the Core Notify initiative, basically sorted from left to right on the representing the maturity level of their respective implementation. And this is just to give you an overview of we're not sitting in our little silo and building something that no one uses, right? This is really a community effort. We're emphasizing the notion of let's work together to codify your use case in Notify, to see how a standards-based approach can help you with your use case and connect with resources that you otherwise wouldn't be able to connect to. So I think this hopefully helps to give insight into how Notify helps to build a sort of distributed and therefore we believe sustainable and interoperable ecosystem of repositories. And you can see the spectrum is wide, the spectrum is broad. The use cases are equally broad, and we'll have resources on our website to give you further insights and overview of where we are with the respective implementations there. So maybe with that, I'll stop here and invite maybe everybody for a discussion. Hand it over to Kathleen and see where we can take it from here.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Peter. Well, actually, I think we're sort of at time, but I think we were supposed to end at 20 minutes after the hour. But I think if people want to stay for questions and answer, that would be great. The room, will be turned over to the next session at the bottom of the hour. So I answered one question already in the chat from Ross asking if the NSF repository had implemented Core Notify. So I don't believe so, but I do think that we will have quite a few more working implementations in 2024, and that might increase the momentum and awareness in the broader community about the value of this kind of functionality. And then there are a couple of questions, I think, more for you, Peter, in the Q&A. So I don't know if you want to just answer them verbally.
Yeah, maybe I can just say that the Core Data Providers Guide, I was just about to send a link. It's on the website now, basically. So there's a published version of it. I'll just paste this. And let me just quickly. There was a question on the. Okay, a resolver is already linked. What's the principles? Searching for questions. I don't actually see any questions that I would need to answer. Kathleen,
there are three questions. They're in the Q&A. So one is, are government repositories already included in your service core?
Government repositories, you mean like the US government repositories, right? I assume.
Yeah, I think so. But they're specifically talking about data repositories. So maybe you could clarify that you're focusing on publications.
Yes, we are focusing on publication repositories, but it doesn't mean that government repositories would not be allowed or eligible basically for indexation in core. Effectively, we are able to index any repositories that supply OAI PMH endpoints basically. And so as long as that is the case, then we are interested in indexing those repositories.
Yeah, and again, just to to clarify, we just launched this pilot project, so we're really starting with 20 repositories that we're focusing on, and from there we will develop these good practice recommendations that will allow other repositories to understand what they need to do in their own local environment to be able to be harvested by Core or other discovery services as well.
Yes. Yes, and so I have just pasted the link, and I'm now in the Q&A. Sorry, I was originally searching just the chat. Was asking for a way to integrate generally with repositories. Since integration of 10,000 repositories is not feasible, is Core working on a way to allow researchers to submit data through the publisher's interfaces to their repositories via standard API? So the usual way we index content is that we effectively rely on an OAI PMH interface that is supplied by the repository. In the Core Data Providers Guide, we effectively explain what is and what needs to be provided on the side of the data provider. There are a couple of data providers who we still index despite them not supplying OAI PMH interface, but this is more of an exception. But one of those exceptions is actually the Crossref database. So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but effectively what it means is that if something has a DOI and is indexed and is available in Crossref, then it is something that will eventually find its way into Core.
Thanks, Peter. And I think we should probably close the session now because there's a new session starting very soon.
Perfect.
So thank you very much again, Peter and Martin. And thanks for everyone who came to the presentation. Please get in touch with us if you have any questions. We are all openly available.